Welcome back to Night School, episode 23. Today we are shifting gears and moving from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, 1892 version, to Emily Dickinson. Walt Whitman is the founding father of American poetry, so we are told. So Dickinson is the founding mother, and they're very interesting parents to have. And so Mr. Wes Schantz and I, who I will introduce in just a moment here, thought we would do Come Slowly, Eden, and then the work Arcturus today. Come Slowly, Eden is very short, 2 stanzas. Arcturus a little bit longer, seems to be based on something like a constellation. And we are again using Poetry Foundation as our source. And so I will share the screen now as I welcome Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back, my esteemed colleague.
Hey, good to be back. A very different poet and a different style today. Also, one that we're not as familiar with as Poe and Whitman. This is not something I've read before, so this will be a cool kind of putting ourselves in the students' shoes a little bit here.
And you know what's interesting about doing this is that even though I know that we approach poetry not from a gendered standpoint, but something that one reads in the literature about Emily Dickinson is that one feature that is striking about her is precisely that she is a woman who deals with sort of women's social issues and the roles of women, like as a wife to a husband on her page here, in particular on Poetry Foundation, and how that can get in the way of, say, her duties as a poet. And so what's interesting is that the humanities community seems to invite reading her as a woman confronting the world in a specifically gendered way, which is interesting because that does seem like a very real and informative way to approach a poet that disagrees with some of the current ideological notions about gender today, I would say. And so if one held those notions that say no gender existed, one would be closed off to a source of meaning from this poet.
Yeah, I mean, that aspect of it does seem to impact how people read poetry, and how the way that poetry is read is different in different time periods and different cultures, I suppose. And insofar as we're trying to get at the roots of our culture and its values and narratives that seem to structure it, I do think it's very important to read as many different voices, people from different places and times, cultures, but also from different backgrounds, other sorts of backgrounds, to kind of get a better sense, a broader sense, to kind of check some of our own blind spots perhaps and biases, and just because it's really interesting also to just hear from people who had very different experiences and maybe saw the world in different ways as a result. So no, I agree. And it would be interesting if at some point, I mean, it seems like we want to find true diversity, but we also want to use discernment and find that which is truly great as well. We want to find a community of individuals who have the best possible and most possible information to convey to us in the best possible or most articulate way. That said, I think we're going to see some cross themes from the 19th century here. Just a couple of things about Emily Dickinson. I'm no scholar on her, but I know 2 things. She's a 19th century American woman who was a poet. So that's essentially what I know. And well, Wes, you've been doing the odds. How about, would you like to start? Yeah. And again, so the way we started looking into her work was through Poetry Foundation, which seems like a real reputable and real useful resource. And so if you start typing in the search bar there, Emily Dickinson, one of the first things that comes up is a page called Emily Dickinson 101, and it's labeled a poetry sampler. And the subtitle is Demystifying One of Our Greatest Poets. So the editors of the page lay out a brief kind of biography and some of her influences and things. The first section is about her school that she was at, and the first poem that they link to is called Come Slowly Eden, and it's number 205 in the numbering system that they've got, that they're working from. So anyway, if you click that link, it takes you to the page Come Slowly Eden. So if you're following along, that's how you find it. As soon as my little page, okay, here we go. So Come Slowly Eden. Come slowly, Eden, lips unused to thee, bashful. Sip thy jessamines as the fainting bee. Reaching late his flower, round her chamber hums, counts his nectars, enters, and is lost in balms.
Well, that's very strong. Well, the first thing I want to notice are these hyphens, these dashes that are moving across the screen. We see them both in the middle of the line and at the end of the line, depending, in every single line except for the fifth or the very first of the second stanza. Another thing I would note is the religious theme of this poem. It's Come Slowly Eden, though there is an inversion of Eden being in the past, now guarded by flame, sword-holding angels, and now being in the future. And there is a sense of that which is coming, or a second coming, or something to pursue. It is very Dante-esque in that we have an image of striving towards Eden as well as an image of the bee, right? Bee imagery is huge in epics. Virgil uses bees as well as Dante. And Dante, in fact, describes the top of heaven, the Paradiso, with the souls of the angels, or the angels as souls. They are souls. He has sort of a Thomas Aquinas idea of how souls and angels work, and Dionysus the Areopagite, pseudo-Dionysus. But he's saying that the souls in heaven are like bees and flowers, and then flowers and bees, and that one gives substance or sustenance to another, and then the other gives sustenance to them. And what the sustenance is in heaven, the nectar of the gods, is information. And so it's almost as if what we're doing through articulating reality and sharing stories is creating the sort of magical castle of Disney, or creating that sort of Edenic place that we are always pursuing. And it is precisely because we are always pursuing it that we always have the best possible thing to do. And so that's what I do with the first sort of 5 lines. Round her chamber hums, counts his nectars, enters, and is lost in balms. I wonder if that also is sort of a commentary on what a human life is. It's like you sort of, go get your nectar, or pursue whatever it is you want. And then you sort of hum around the circle of the years. We circle the sun. And, well, what do you make of enters and is lost in balms?
Well, so the whole thing seems to be a simile, right, between the lips and by extension the poet, I take it, who's speaking, and the bee, right? And the second stanza is filling out the image of the bee, and saying what happens to the bee is that he reaches the flower, he goes into it and does his work, and in so doing is, as he says there at the end, lost in balms. And so it seems like a combination of work and delight, which is very attractive to me, thinking about sort of the purpose of literature and of education, those two things. And I take this a bit from formulations that Philip Pullman uses in his essays and speeches and things. He talks about responsibility and delight as being the co-equal kind of foundations of an education, or what it should look like. And so, the bee is a worker, right? It's traditionally used as a kind of metaphor for hard work, but it's also the honey, the sweetness, and in this case, the as yet unrefined sweetness of what's in the flower. And so you could take that to be like the inspiration behind the poem, which you're seeking to realize in the work of the poem, and that you can get lost in that. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, because meanwhile you're doing the work, it's like, it seems like you get to have both of those things in the space of the poem, which is kind of the flower, or the Eden here, that's being evoked.
And I do want to ask about the lips unused to thee, and whether that means sort of like the use of the poetic tongue or the use of speaking the truth through symbols. But I also want to ask about the change in pronoun in stanza 2, lines 1 and 2, and then 3. Reaching late his flower, the bee seems to be the antecedent there, round her chamber hums. Who is that her? Has he just changed gender, or is he sort of an androgynous bee, or are there two bees? And then counts his nectars. I'm not sure what's happening.
Yeah, no, I took that to mean, and I think I read it wrong. I was assuming his, and that probably says a lot about me. But yeah, reaching late his flower, the bee's flower, round her chamber, the chamber of the flower, I take that to mean.
Ah, that's good. That's very good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that must be the antecedent. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you have to read poetry slowly, right? Your eye skipped over one of these details, and when I looked at this detail, I just could not think of what the antecedent to the pronoun was. And I think that that's a big reason why sometimes people get frustrated and quit reading, right? They just assume something doesn't make sense. But when they think it through, then they learn something valuable, and they learn that maybe they weren't looking at this closely enough, which is clearly what was true for me there. And why it's also helpful to read this in conjunction with someone else who you're talking this to, because I didn't notice that until you said something or until you explained it.
Yeah, I mean, so she tells you that right in the opening of the poem too, is to go slowly, right? And that's kind of interesting because the lines are very short, and the poem seems very simple as a result, maybe, but it's definitely extremely rich and complex and very carefully structured. I wanted to talk a little about the poetic form here.
Yes.
So trying to count the syllables a little bit, it seems like it's very regular. The first line, the second line, I'm counting 5 syllables in each. Come slowly, Eden, lips unused to thee. Then bashful, sip digesamines. Bashful, sip digesamines. I'm counting 6 or 7, depending on how you want to pronounce that.
So she's very different from Whitman. She
Exactly.
gets to say more with her structure rather than saying what she wants without being bound by structure.
Yeah. And
that's interesting, because something she can then do that opens up to her is that when we notice parallels like the rhyme of thee and be, we can also observe a connection between thee, capitalized there is obviously God, especially given the title of the poem, and then be, sort of a connection to the natural world, which Dante does as well as Whitman as well. That sort of theological or divine connection to that which is also natural and mundane.
Yeah, well, yeah, and her capitalization is very interesting. Again, it seems very intentional and idiosyncratic at the same time. The places where the line length varies also stand out as a result. You know, just like those capital letters sort of stand out, the places where the line length varies from the regular 5 to more or fewer. There's one in the second stanza, the third line has fewer syllables. It counts his nectars, only 4. It's like you're missing something there. And then the next line is longer, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. The word enters is like leading you into this longer and actually sort of, in a sense, infinite line, because if you're reading it the way I am, that those balms are kind of an inspiration or a delight in the uncreated poem, right? Well, then that's effectively infinite, and the line is a bit longer, yeah, but you reading it can get lost as well in sort of thinking about it, and that's where it leaves you. The poem leaves you in that space of the flower,
right? And just something about the structure that you've helped me to see is that through observing the structure that closely, you can see the meaning of the poem, which is entering and being lost in delight in the flower and the acquisition of that which is necessary for the hive. For us, that's information. So the poem is actually describing the act of getting sucked into a poem, right? Of reading a poem and entering into focusing in on the poem itself and deriving the information from it, or the delight, and sort of becoming numb to the rest of the world for that moment. The sort of enrapturing effect of focusing on something and enfolding oneself within it as one draws out from it that which is valuable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and like the word jessamine, I had to look up, but it means jasmine basically.
Ah,
So it's like, flowers which are exotic. It's an archaic word for it. The word itself sounds very floral and has a kind of odor, a very um, a sort of a tea as well, right? It's like it's very tactile in that way, and the word counts there, like that's what you're doing as you read the poem or writing it. You're counting your feet, you're keeping straight your syllables, but that's only like half of the process, right? Of course, the other half is the fainting, the sort of surrender to the force of the idea, and the feeling. So yeah,
right.
I found it's a great little poem here.
Yeah, so yeah, that's interesting how you're describing the sort of balance between intentionality and structure being applied to sort of the richness of experience or intuition, which you are attempting to share, and how perhaps applying structure to that intuition helps to enhance the meaning of it rather than to detract from it, which would be clearly why we would ever write poetry, right? Not to be more enigmatic, but to express more information in the most sophisticated way we possibly can.
Nice.
So,
Yeah. And both of these, so the next one, Arcturus, is his other name, uh, is another sort of science-y poem. So do you want to go ahead and read that one?
sure. And I'll ask you about that reaching late his flower at some point. Why late? Why late? All right, Arcturus. This is from poemhunter.com. And those of you watching on YouTube, you can see it now. Arcturus. Arcturus is his other name. I'd rather call him Star. It's very mean of science to go and interfere. I slew a worm the other day, a savant passing by, murmured resurgam centipede. Oh Lord, how frail are we. I pull a flower from the woods, a monster with a glass, computes the stamens in a breath, and has her in a class. Whereas I took the butterfly, aforetime in my hat, he sits erect in cabinets, the clover bells forgot. What once was heaven is zenith now, where I propose to go. When time's brief masquerade was done, is mapped and charted too. What if the poles should frisk about and stand upon their heads? I hope I'm ready for the worst, whatever prank betides.
Sorry, you cut out there. There's two more stanzas.
Oh, sorry, I read them. I don't know if they got recorded.
No, it stopped after whatever prank betides, then perhaps the kingdom.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. I just need to scale down. Okay. Brief sabbatical. Perhaps the kingdom of heaven's changed. I hope the children there won't be new-fashioned when I come and laugh at me and stare. I hope the Father in the skies will lift his little girl, old-fashioned, not everything, over the style of Pearl. Emily Dickinson. All right. Excuse me for that. I apologize.
No problem. No. So this is the fun thing about reading it off a web page. I think there's definitely a typo or two here too. That one line, I hope the children there, it looks like it's supposed to break and go on to the next line, won't be new fashioned when I come. I think that's got to be the third line of that.
Okay, and we can look that. Yeah, we can look that up, and because that, again, that's something very important about poetry, right? That you actually get the lines right, so that you can make the appropriate connections between the author's intention and what's there, and actually understanding the poem, right? Because if it's like fixing a ghost car if you are trying to analyze a poem that's not correctly formatted or has errors like those.
Well, but that's part of the fun too. I mean, until very, very recently, there were no real fixed authoritative texts for anything. And so part of it was, reading what the scribes wrote down and trying to figure out what was supposed to be written, what mistakes the manuscript might have in it. And
Sure. But as we become more sophisticated in maintaining the written word, I think I think we can, especially with 19th century American authors, rather than like someone writing in a medieval codice or codex, maintain their words with a little more integrity. But yes, I take what you mean with good spirit.
Yeah. All right. So this is poem 70. I take that mean that this is a slightly earlier poem, maybe. It's much longer than most of the poems I've seen from her, but then maybe I just don't know that much about her forms usually. It does mostly follow the same kind of form with these four-line stanzas. Still has a lot of those cuts, those dashes, which are pretty seem pretty particular to her style. Um, so she's writing about this time a like a difference in lexicon, I guess, between scientific words and everyday words. And she seems to like to put the words that she wants to focus on in quotes. So Arcturus, and she'd rather call him star. In the next one, she has a savant passing by who murmurs resurgam, centipede. And then she or someone remarks, "Oh Lord, how frail are we?" About that whole little scene, right? Where she killed the worm, and the person walking by said, "Come back to life" or something. Um, so she talks about the difference between looking at a flower in the woods and then looking at it under a microscope, I guess, a glass, and counting the stamens. So there's that sort of computing or counting image there again, like the very different ways in which you can appreciate nature, I suppose. She has the butterfly, right, that she caught in her hat versus the one that's fixed in a cabinet, like a cabinet of curiosities or of specimens, I guess. Um, and and she points out there that when you see it inside in the cabinet, then you've forgotten the clover bells. That's its natural sort of setting, I guess. The next one is really kind of getting back to the cosmic thing that the poem seems to start from with the stars. So now we're in heaven, but we call it zenith now. Um, it's also been mapped and charted, right? Um, and she contrasts, I think, although she doesn't name it, time and eternity there too. And maybe in the next stanza, she's referring to the magnetic poles and how over long enough periods of time they actually switch. I don't know if that was something that was being discovered at that time or not. But she asks in a kind of playful mode there, like, so what if they switch places? So what if they move, because the magnetic north actually does sort of move around a bit. I think it's because of the wobble of the Earth on its axis. I'm not really sure, but anyway, she's ready for the worst, and she puts that in quotes. Then she puts the kingdom of heaven and children there into quotes as well. So she's like, these are kind of her specimens, I take it, that she's like standing back from and trying to look at objectively and with a certain amount of irony, like ironic distance. That when she's, when she's dead, right? When she's in the heavens, as she imagines, she's worried, or maybe mock worried, that the children there will also have changed in the meantime from what she imagined they'd be. The father in the skies will lift his little girl, old-fashioned, not everything. So there's a paradox there, right? She's the little girl, she's old-fashioned, she's nothing, not, but she's also everything. And over the style of pearl, I guess that's the pearly gates is how I'm reading that. So like she's hoping that there's something that's not changing. But again, I get it. I detect a certain amount of mockery here. So I don't know how literally to read that and how much it's sort of her kind of playing around a bit. The style of pearl also seems to be a pun, right? Because style is not just like a physical thing. It's more often now we use that. It's maybe a homonym rather, but we use the word style to talk about a way of speaking or of writing. And so, she has a very particular style. I don't know if I'd call it a pearly style. It's not fancy particularly, but it is very artful. And and in some ways very delicate too. So maybe it's not a bad kind of threshold for entering
perhaps, yeah, perhaps something valuable crafted over time from something that started off as common, which is how pearl is made, right? It's like some sand that falls into an oyster or a clam. And,
right.
And then it sort of just clamps down on it and over time shines it up, or however specifically it works. But it's something I want to comment on in this poem is the kingdom of heaven, language, the Father in the skies, the resurgam, I shall rise again. That's a Christ image. Talking about Arcturus being depersonified and de-anthropomorphized into star from science. What seems to be happening here is something that's happening in the Miltonic poem during the scientific revolution, and also what Whitman was sort of experiencing in his poem Song of Myself, a change from an anthropomorphized mythological view of the universe, even theologically grounded from the Greco-Roman sort of gods through the sort of Christian gods. And so now the world, the heavens are no longer the heavens, it's the sky. And the constellations, which represented stories of heroes, well, those are just, balls of gas. And, but she says, man, what's going to change next? Because this is like the opposite of how we used to think. And so now can we even trust thinking? What if the poles should frisk about and stand upon their head? She's like, what do we not doubt now? What can we not doubt? And that's very much Miltonic and comes through in the in Paradise Lost. What paradise is the worldview of humans that kept them sane in the world, which had, due to the work of Galileo and the changing worldview from geocentric to heliocentric, had cast doubt on not only the limits of human knowledge, but also on the foundations of religious experience and beliefs, and also upon whether any religious experience ever could be fully believed in, or anything, since the most foundational beliefs we had turned out to be wrong in those moments. And so she seems to be contending with the fact that words change as beliefs about the world or ideas about the world change. As we look at the world differently, we start to describe it with different words. And she seems to be cataloging how that change happens. And it seems to be happening during her time. And she also mentions like the butterfly, which recalls to me, say, the butterfly effect, or how things change slowly. And like one word might change, but it's evidence of something bigger. You might feel pain in your side, but it might be evidence of something bigger or deeper underlying. And also, of course, she showed her knowledge of Latin. I don't know that she had knowledge of Greek, but she may well have, if she had sort of a traditional 19th century American education, which would have featured Greek and Latin up through college level. In fact, the Harvard entrance exam required calculus, Greek, Latin, and some other very difficult knowledge that I don't have. But butterfly, the word for that in Greek is psyche, or soul. And so, again, like with Whitman, religious language perforates this poem, while also a description of the reduction or the transition from looking at the world in sort of that religious way to looking at it in a natural way, but also recognizing something being hewed off from our observation of the world in looking at it more scientifically. There seems to be something like a joke, she says, whatever prank betides in us now looking this way. It's like we've been empowered by this way of seeing the world, but lost our connection to meaning or something, because she still returns to hope, like Dante at the end. I hope the Father in the skies will lift his little girl, old-fashioned, not everything, over the style of the pearl, which makes me almost think old-fashioned, indicating that she has been fashioned over time, perhaps due to evolution or something like that, or that each human generation, humans only change so much. And so we are sort of the culmination of the longest process that has ever existed, the process of life. And that she hopes that this has meaning, this process.
Right. The meaning of it does seem to be sort of open to or prone to change as well, right? That seems to be the sense of those last couple of stanzas in particular, right? Like how, like, as you say, how far does this flexibility and meanings and names for things go? I also thought it was interesting how she personifies science at the
Yes.
beginning, right? It's mean of science to go and interfere. Um, like again, I feel like there's sort of two ways to look at that. On the one hand, it's a uh, talking about how differently you look at things when you stand back and look at them scientifically, and there is something that's lost there. But I think it's also maybe at least a little bit of her poking fun at that kind of critique, right? Because of course science was very much in the ascendant and definitely leads to lots of new kinds of understanding and new problems that can be solved as well. So there's, you know, there is something sort of ironic about saying that it's mean of science to go into and interfere, because on the other hand, its interference brings about plenty of positive discoveries and new ways of solving problems too. The other thing there that I come back to too is time, right? She characterizes it as a masquerade, um, and it's, the image of a masquerade. You're sort of wearing a mask. You're concealing something, and what's concealed, right, is your truth, or something like that, or the true nature of things. So when we've mapped the heavens and call it the zenith and this and that, what we've only really mapped the masks, seems to be her point there. We haven't mapped the underlying reality, and that seems to be where she kind of goes in the last part of the poem. I know a number of her poems are related to death and hope and things like that. So I think it's interesting that that's kind of prefigured here in this. I'm assuming an early poem.
Yeah, I'm looking at those lines when time's brief masquerade was done, is mapped and charted to, and to what extent that might suggest that the pattern of existence that we occupy might be understood and codified, but that doesn't necessarily make the experience of existence any easier. And that even if we do have this superpower and this super knowledge from science, it is a tool to inform us, but does not necessarily, it's not like a super tool. I mean, it is a super tool, but it's not like a perfect, divine, going to make everything perfect and easy in life tool. We're still going to have life. We're still going to experience much the same things as we would have experienced a long time ago in terms of like fear and aggression and, tiredness and irritability. And I don't know that it's almost as if she's suggesting that for all we've done so little. I suppose that's sort of what you're saying there too. But that but I do agree, just to transition points, that she does have a very light tone here, a very airy tone, sort of poking fun tone, calling it mean. And I do wonder what that's supposed to mean in this case, because she does seem to be talking about, a fairly serious change in attitude and perspective, perspective on how to see the world. But she's sort of like joking about it as if it's not the most important thing or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess to go back to the other poem as well, you're pointing out about that the bee is reaching the flower late. That sense of being a late comer is kind of echoed in this Arcturus poem too, right? That there's sort of that whole world of meaning and stuff has been there and is established, and now we're arriving to the masquerade kind of late and towards the end even maybe, and we're finding that things are changing, that if we're going to understand anything we need to do it quickly before it's gone. That seems to be the sense there. The feeling of being a latecomer or a late bloomer, right? implies too that you've sort of, again, like worked at something and are sort of now starting to reap the harvest of your work.
Right.
And
That's interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting on so many levels. Like on, like, say, a religious Christian level, the idea of the tree or the vine with the new branches that Paul brings up, like they're the older Hebrew branches, but now the newer Christian ones, but they partake of the same tree. The idea of sort of indenturing oneself to a craft like poetry and developing sort of in slavery for several years in order to develop that freedom of will that skill affords oneself in a craft, and the ability to maximize self-expression through one's skill. And so it's almost like now late come in life, but now fully free as a poet, as a free expresser or articulator of that which one has understood and experienced. She can express herself, but also as part of the poetic tradition too, right? Like something we run into with Dante as well as Whitman is now we're late to the game because you're the newest player of the game. You're the newest representative or embodiment of the role of poet. And so you're late in that this masquerade has been going on. This party's been going on for quite some time, and everything that's been produced has been by everybody who is not you, who has been part of the party. And now it's time to contribute or to, leave your mask in this this party of ghosts that one living soul will someday travel to, hopefully, again.
Yeah, it's so she doesn't assert herself in the same way that Whitman does,
right.
Or Poe. Poe's speaker is also very like neurotically concerned about himself, but she's certainly the narrator, the speaker of the poems is certainly an interesting and notable personality within this, in terms of form and style, but also just in terms of content as well. And the way that she talks about herself and her experience and how it relates to, by implication to us reading the poem, perhaps being aspiring poets or scientists or both. These are all things that concern us nearly. And so, yeah, I like that way of interpreting it. I'm real excited to kind of keep going through this body of work. We'll see how it develops here.
Yeah, and do you have any ideas on what we would like to do for next time? One or two poems, or do we want to leave the audience in suspense?
Well, the next ones that are listed there are more that the editors here relate to her experience at school. So things like surgeons must be very careful, and faith is fine invention. So maybe those two. And if we get to it, there's one that's apparently inspired by or commemorates the death of Charlotte Bronte. So another influence on her literary influence, the Brontes. So maybe we'll get to that one too.
Well, wonderful. And I do think that Emily Dickinson is the first female author that we have confronted, if I'm not mistaken. We've read and watched a lot together now, but I'm very glad to give her her due, and looking forward to reading more of her and possibly the Brontes. And definitely I want to go through Middlemarch at some point, possibly when we're a lot farther along, 2 or 3 years from now. But I think that would be great as well, George Eliot. And, someone I've never really given much time to, and I know I'm mentioning English authors here, not just American ones, is, oh no, her name has fallen out of my head. In graduate school, I think you and Aaron Desmond were very influenced or very much like this poet. Or this author, oh no, what was her? I think she's Irish, very popular with people who tend to be depressed.
I don't know. There's a few possibilities here. Is it Virginia Woolf?
She would be great.
Flannery O'Connor?
Yes, Flannery O'Connor. That's the one.
Okay.
That's the one. Yeah, Virginia Woolf I also have very limited engagement with. I've only ever read the play by Edward Albee, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which I thought was a profoundly ugly play. Just, emotionally, psychologically, but, that's another author I'd really like to read. So there we go.
Cool. Well, yeah, there's a whole, I mean, the canon is big. There's lots of voices in it, and it's always expanding, is the sense that I get at least. So it's
Yeah, well, I
cool.
guess we'll just have to do our best to keep up and to report how language and our perspectives on the world and the meaning within it are changing, and leave our ghosts, our Tom Riddles in the diary for the next people who will come, learn from the book of lore. All
Sounds good.
right, till next time, Wes. I'm glad to be starting out on a new poet, the third American poet, with you.
Yeah, likewise. Take it easy.
You too.